once you see the problem, and this is the issue with testing, you need to know why it's happening. And that's where context is really important. So it's like, what is your diet? What is your stress level? What is your body composition? What is your micronutrient status? What is your thyroid status? What is your adrenal status? What is your metabolic status in terms of insulin resistance, oxidative stress? So in all these circumstances, inflammation, excess body fat, low thyroid function, micronutrient deficiencies, insulin resistance, all of these things will lower testosterone. But if you fix some of those other problems, a lot of times the testosterone values will come up.
Welcome back to the Rooted in Resilience podcast. Today, we're excited to have Mike Fave on to discuss all things male fertility, testosterone, how he's preparing for him and his wife having kids in the future, and his experiences with working with several clients in improving their testosterone levels, and the discussion of male hormones, because I think that gets left out of many conversations these days. So, Mike, welcome to the show. And before we clicked play, we were getting started on you and your wife are thinking about and getting started trying to have a baby. And Sarah and Brandon are at a very similar stage. And I think that that's a place where a lot of our audience is at, or maybe they're going to be at that place. And so Mike and his wife have started trying. And I guess what's been experienced so far, and what have you done for boosting your testosterone and improving your fertility?
Yeah. So first of all, thanks for having me on, guys. I'm happy to be here. Um, Essentially, the first step, at least for my wife and I, was just to get like a testing done, and before we even tried, right, just to see where things were at, just to see where hormones were at, just to see where general health was at, because I think it's important for even before conception for the parents to be healthy, right? Because that's going to determine what's going on with the man's sperm quality, and then that's going to determine what's going to go on with the egg quality of the woman, and then the health of the body of the woman when she's like developing the child. So getting that down first. So my wife and I have been doing that for a while. We've been married for a number of years now, and basically and we've been together even before that, right? We were together for many years before we were even married. And the whole thing was like, we just want to be in the healthiest state possible. And then to gauge where we were at, we then did a bunch of testing to see where things were going on. So I don't know if you guys want me to talk about some of the tests that we did, but we looked at that to see where some of the problems were. And the major areas that we looked at were metabolic function. So for both of us, we did hemoglobin A1Cs, insulin, a comprehensive metabolic panel, and then we did GGT, which is a more specific liver function marker. And then I also looked at uric acid, which can give you an indication of some of the metabolic function going on at the liver. We did, just for the fun of it, I did advanced cardiovascular stuff because I do these labs with my clients all the time. So I also want to see where I'm at, where my wife's at, these different components. So some of those labs some of the labs included an NMR lipid panel. So basically they look at the fractions of lipoproteins using an MRI, ApoB, ApoA1, oxidized LDL, and things like this. So we're looking at some of these components. Then we looked at full mineral status, and this is the mineral status, metabolic function are really important. We'll get into why. But the mineral status was for calcium, it was D3 and parathyroid hormone. Then an RBC magnesium for magnesium, plasma zinc, plasma selenium, serum copper, and a ceruloplasmin. Those are both for copper status. Iron panel and ferritin for iron. So iron panels, TIBC, serum iron, and iron saturation. And then we looked at B12 folate homocysteine to see methylation status, because I personally have like pretty bad MTHFR genes. The whole thing is slow. My wife doesn't. Complete blood counts, thyroid function, full panel, adrenal function. And then for myself, and I can go into the specifics of those, but for myself, I did testicular function, which was a variety of components: estrogen, testosterone, free testosterone, SHBG, LH, FSH, prolactin. And then for my wife, hers included the same components, except there's a progesterone on there and an anti-Müllerian hormone, which is really important for women to get a sense of what's going on with their ovarian function, their ovarian reserve, and an inflammatory value, so CRP and ESR. And also, there's another one that's more sensitive called Glyc A that you can get with your NMR lipid panels. We did a Glyc A as well. So we looked at all of these components for both of us just to see what was going on. Um, and then basically, we actually found some interesting stuff, not for me, but for my wife. That was what actually made a huge difference for us because we wouldn't have been able to have children if we didn't find it. I know it's about guys. I could share that if you want
Yeah,
that
yeah.
story if you want, or
Wait, Sarah, have you and Brandon done this testing?
No, this has not been done. This testing has not been done here. But, okay, first off, I think it's awesome that you did this testing for yourself. Like, it's really cool that you have the knowledge to read these tests and understand what's going on. So, if anybody who was just listening to that long list is like, "I'm intrigued," know that Mike can do that testing and read it for you. So, yeah, I would love to know what you found for your wife and also what you found for yourself and your wife that encouraged some shifts for you to do maybe in your nutrition or your lifestyle.
so mine was actually not for my own personal self. My copper status was like, and I've with some of this testing was like terrible. Like I wound up my serum copper was below reference range. My ceruloplasmin was below reference range. And then when I followed up because there's certain types of disease like Wilson's disease that you can get. It's a genetic disease that alters your copper metabolism, and you can't really just gauge on a serum copper and a ceruloplasmin. So I did a 24-hour urinary copper, and that also came back super low. So it wasn't Wilson's. I was just copper deficient. Don't didn't 100% know why, but I repleted. I felt a lot better. Like it was game changer for me. Just that. So there's even like, I have my diet dialed in, I have it in Chronometer, I see all this stuff, but sometimes there's some weird things that pop up. And I think specifically for me, my mom went gray when she was like 20, and I started going gray when I was 15. And copper's involved in the pigmentation of hair follicles. So I was thinking that maybe I don't know exactly, but maybe there's some genetic copper stuff for me, which is very specific to me. And you only kind of I'm in interest in this stuff and I'm looking at it. So I get a little bit anal and detailed about some of it. So that's how I am. But that was something that came back for me. And I think there's maybe some component like that there. For my wife, what we actually found was her prolactin. So we had done testing when we were working the ICU during COVID. We were working travel contracts, and her cortisol was over the reference range, and her prolactin was over the reference range. But we were working like 14-hour days with no breaks, and it was like some weeks we were working 5 days, 5 days a week for 14 hours a day, and then other days it was like 4 times a week. So we were pretty exhausted and we were pretty stressed. So I just chalked it up to stress initially. Um, and then her AMH had actually come back low, which I thought was a function of the prolactin impacting the gonadotropic hormones that work with the ovaries. So I was like, okay, we'll retest once we finish this contract before we like do all the stuff. And then we were out of the contract and we retested, and her prolactin was like sky high. And I was like, oh man, I don't know. I don't know why it's high. Like we're not stressed anymore. Like we had stopped working like that. To be fair, while we were in the contract, she lost her hair. She like her cycles got all messed up, like terrible, terrible health stuff. It didn't working that much and that hard wasn't a good thing. Um, so we followed up, and I was like, there's only a couple things that could be going on for her. Is like maybe she's endometriosis. Her LH FSH ratio was off. So I was like, okay, maybe PCOS, but her testosterone was normal, her insulin was normal, and her AMH was actually low, and PCOS, it tends to be a little bit on the higher side. So I was like, this is weird. So we then rolled out endometriosis. There's a series of tests you can do. I think it's IL-8, tumor necrosis factor alpha, interleukin 6, and HSCRP. And so we checked those things, and then essentially they were okay. I think I couldn't get interleukin 8, but those came back okay. So the next thing was maybe she has a prolactinoma, which is a small tumor on the pituitary that secretes prolactin and suppresses ovarian function. And she could have had it for a while because when we first met, she had some thyroid issues that we resolved. Um, and then basically he is like, all right, we got to do the MRI and see. So we did the MRI, and she actually had a prolactinoma. And if we didn't do this testing beforehand, we wouldn't have been able to see that her prolactin was high from this tumor, and then she wouldn't have been able to get pregnant
Oh, wow.
because the prolactin was suppressed ovarian function. So I think the early testing before you're going to start to try can be quite helpful. And I've had quite a few clients where the doctors didn't want to really test anything up front, and they weren't getting, like, the woman wasn't getting pregnant, and then the doctor's like, "Oh, just give it give it 6 months, give it a year," and it's like, just look. And for a couple of women, like they, oh, my AMH is low, or my prolactin is super high, or my I have indications of PCOS or things like this, and then getting those things under control is like, okay, then fertility went fine. So I think the testing is really important beforehand to try to figure out where the problems are. And even if you have everything dialed in, sometimes you don't know what exactly you have going on, and that's a way to kind of gauge what's going on and make adjustments there.
Yeah, 'cause think of all the stuff we've all done in the past, right? And we don't know what the consequences were on various parts of the body, right? So that's really insightful. And I wish that that was like a pre-screening for pregnancy, because imagine how much frustration that would save people and how much money, right? IVF is expensive. And if they do the testing before, can dial things in before trying to get pregnant. Is this encouraging you to do some testing?
I don't think my husband will. He's not really in the world that we're in. So he's like,
Yeah.
"Let's just try and, see what happens." So I think we'll see. I'm interested in the testing for myself because I think that's fascinating, and I like just having data. But I'm curious, so we know what's important for the female to look for based on what your wife experienced, but what would you specifically think is the most important thing that you were looking for in your lab results?
For me, well, I guess I'll talk about it for myself, but also in general. So I'm trying to when a guy's trying to get have a baby with his wife or partner or whatever the deal is, or just looking at general hormonal function. The first thing I'm looking at, if the problem is hormonal function, is I'm looking at the hormones themselves. So that's your testosterone, free testosterone. DHT, it's just kind of expensive. That's why I didn't list it. It's like, especially turmeric, the LCMS one is more expensive. Then there's estradiol, LH, FSH, and SHBG. So those components will tell you what's going on with the hormonal system. So the LH, and I'll start from the top. LH and FSH come from the pituitary gland and signal, particularly LH, to the testicles to produce testosterone. And there's a variety of ways that they do that, but essentially the LH induces the star protein, which is a protein that brings cholesterol into the mitochondria. And then that cholesterol is turned first into pregnenolone through CYP11A1, and then it gets converted to DHEA and androstenedione and then testosterone. So if LH signaling is wonky, you have a circumstance where you're not going to produce testosterone, and FSH is involved in sperm production. So that's a secondary testosterone issues from the pituitary. Primary is when something's off with the steroidogenic pathways, right? The LH signaling is there, but the testicles just aren't getting it done. So you're looking at LH and FSH to see, like, is there a problem at the pituitary? Are they super high for some reason, right? Is there something going on there? The next thing you look at is, obviously, where's your testosterone value, which is the output from the testicles. And so you first have your total testosterone, which gives you an idea of the amount of hormone being produced. You can say, hey, my production is fine. But then on top of that, you also have free testosterone and SHBG. Free testosterone, and this is a little wonky in the bioenergetic sphere, but technically free testosterone is the testosterone has a target action at the tissues, and because the testosterone can be bound to albumin and SHBG, so SHBG being sex hormone binding globulin. So if your production is fine and your signaling from the pituitary is fine, the next problem that you could wonder is my SHBG too high and I don't have a lot of free testosterone that's making its way to the tissues to have the effect that testosterone does, right? The increase in muscle mass, bones, conversion to DHT, body hair growth, all this type of stuff. So then you can see that. Then you have estradiol, and this is an important one. Is the testosterone can convert into two pathways to a large extent, two major ones, right? You have estradiol on one side, and you have DHT on the other side. DHT is the potent male hormone. This is like gives you the secondary sexual characteristics. It's what gets converted, testosterone gets converted to at the target tissues. You also have estradiol. Now, estradiol is not a female hormone per se. It's more a hormone of like growth, or Ray call it the hormone of new beginnings, right? So basically, if you get injured or there's a need for tissue growth or cellular growth, estradiol gets produced. So you don't want to have estradiol all the way nuked at the bottom of the range. There's in the bioenergetic sphere, I see a lot of guys like, oh, I need estrogen as low as possible. That's not a good idea. There's some symptoms that can develop from that, but you also don't want to have estradiol super rocked up to the top end of the range. So I'm usually looking for an estradiol value between 20 to 30 picograms. I think it's picograms per milliliter. And then I'm typically looking for a ratio of testosterone to estradiol of 20 to 1. So 20 times as much testosterone as there is estradiol. And then the testosterone value that I'm looking for typically is greater than 700 nanograms per deciliter. Then the free depends on the range that you're really looking at. So you're usually wanting the upper quartile of the range for free and the upper quartile for DHT as well. So that would be like an optimal panel. And an LH and FSH somewhere between two, I think LH 2 to 6 and an FSH 2 to 8. So those are micro international units per milliliter in those for the units there. So those are the targets that I'm typically looking for just for the hormones. And so you're just first looking, okay, where's the problem there? Now, and I guess I'll leave I don't know if you guys want me to stop here before I get into the next piece. I'll keep going.
You're fine. You're fine.
So once you see the problem, and this is the issue with testing, you need to know why it's happening. And that's where context is really important. So it's like, what is your diet? What is your stress level? What is your body composition? What is your micronutrient status? What is your thyroid status? What is your adrenal status? What is your metabolic status in terms of insulin resistance, oxidative stress, and things like inflammation? What's going on with your liver, right? So that's where I do all those other labs. So I can say, hey, there's a problem with your testosterone or your hormones, your male hormones, but why? And so that's why I'll look at the diet. You set something up in Chronometer, and then you start looking at some of the other lab values. Oh, okay, well, your CRP, which is an inflammatory marker, it's X, or your thyroid function is low. So in all these circumstances, inflammation, excess body fat, low thyroid function, micronutrient deficiencies, insulin resistance, all of these things will lower testosterone. So you don't want to just go and be like, yeah, all right, here's your replacement, especially if you want to get pregnant, because that's going to suppress your sperm production if you just go on TRT, testosterone replacement therapy. But if you fix some of those other problems, a lot of times the testosterone values will come up. I've had clients who are type 2 diabetics double their testosterone levels once I got they're on insulin, but once I got their testosterone or their weight in a good spot, and I got their metabolic function in a good spot, their testicular function picked back up, even after being diabetic for like decades. So it's the things can shift if you get the other fundamental components right. And that's why you want to look at everything all together. People are like, why are you doing so many labs? Does that have to do with testosterone? It's like, well, they all impact your testicular function and the hypothalamic pituitary testicular axis. So you want to look at everything.
Yeah, I think when somebody doesn't really understand the, like, domino effect that can occur in the body, if they were to get a low testosterone blood result back, the it seems as though, like, the logical conclusion is to just take testosterone, right? But like you said, that doesn't actually solve the root of the issue, and it's not really gonna help in the case of pregnancy. It might mask symptoms or change what you're experiencing, but it's definitely not helping at the cellular level. So what would you say are the main reasons that somebody might be experiencing low testosterone? I know you reviewed them briefly, but if we could just list
Yeah.
them out for people.
Yeah, of course, of course. So there's actually quite a few really important issues. One of the big ones is, and I see this with quite a few guys, if body fat percentage is too high, the fat tissue itself will actually convert the testosterone into estrogen, because the fat tissue has a high amount of the aromatase enzyme, which takes testosterone and makes estrogen. So if fat's high, you get a lot of estrogen. And this is actually not so great because estrogen has a feedback mechanism on LH and FSH at the pituitary. So estrogen tells your pituitary gland, like, guys, chill out. No, we don't need any more of this LHFSH stuff. And then that doesn't signal the testicles to actually produce testosterone, and also can impact sperm function. So by bringing body fat percentage down, and I'm not saying you need to step on stage, Mr. Olympia stuff, right? There's a Goldilocks zone for everything. So, for guys, you're looking somewhere to be between 10 to 20% body fat, and somewhere around 10 to 15 being probably like optimal. Less than 10, the research doesn't show good associations with like long-term health outcomes, and greater than 20, it's the same deal. So there's a Goldilocks zone that you're looking for. So getting that under control. On top of that, and this is something I think is less talked about, but the fat tissue also secretes inflammatory mediators like tumor necrosis factor alpha and interleukin 6. And these directly have an impact on the LH signaling on Leydig cells, which are the cells in the testicles that produce testosterone. And then also the Leydig cell function itself. So the inflammatory signaling from the fat tissue plus the estrogen creates a perfect soup of low testosterone. So minimize or getting body composition under control makes a huge difference. And I've seen guys just get body composition under control, improve their testosterone levels.
I think it's important to really dial in for people because I think many people think body fat is just like this tissue blubber that just chills out in your body. It's just sitting there, right? No, it is metabolically active tissue that is releasing compounds. Like you said, it's increasing the conversion of testosterone into estradiol, which is not good. And then it's also releasing inflammatory compounds that are going to impact your metabolic rate. They're going to impact your digestion. And like you said, your hormonal signaling. And I think we've just kind of normalized being like that's just the norm these days is being overweight, having higher body fat percentages. But there are clear consequences to that because we're seeing testosterone nosedive for men. And so I think you just explained it perfectly, but it's important for people to remember that is active tissue in your body that having too much of it is causing problems. It's also like a storage vehicle tank where your body can store estradiol, it can store toxins, and it's going to cause problems as well.
Yes. And even outside of fertility and testosterone, if somebody's having metabolic dysfunction, and this is true, and this is something that I think bothers people to some extent, but even if you lose weight in the most terrible way possible, taking off the body fat, I'm not suggesting that people do that, but taking off the body fat does improve tons of metabolic markers and function because of these elements of body fat. Now, and that's why I think people see benefits when they go do a carnivore or keto diet and they lose 100 pounds. Like your markers are going to get better, period, because of the body fat stuff. Is that the best way to do it? Do you create problems when you do that? Yes, you create problems, and no, it's not the best way, but you will see changes just from getting the body fat off because the high levels of body fat, and I see this, I read labs every day. So like, I know I'm like rattling off labs, but because I work with people 7 days a week and I'm doing client calls 7 days a week, I'm always looking at labs. So I'm just used to talking about it, just used to seeing it. But I can see in people's labs, I have clients where as their body composition shifts, even if I don't really pull big levers in their diet, massive changes in their lipid panel, A1Cs, inflammatory values, things like this, without even doing special things for that, just as body composition gets in a good spot. And so I think that's a really important factor. The body fat, and it's not that it's bad, but too much of it creates a metabolic problem for the tissues, on top of the fact that you release free fatty acids after a certain threshold all the time that can impair the ability of insulin to work effectively at the tissues. So these are like, you want to make sure that body fat is under control from fertility, from general health, all of these different components, because the high amounts of it do actually pose a negative impact on your overall health across the board. It is really important to actually get it under control. Um,
This is talked about for women because, you hear about like gestational diabetes and things like that, but it's not really talked about the male counterpart, how that's potentially playing a role in the success of the fertility of the couple. So I think that it's a difficult conversation to have because it's not something you want to like make someone feel bad about, but it is important.
Yeah, like from the female perspective, like, okay, because as you know, when you're in a marriage or partnership, like somebody might care about health more than the other person. So, like, how do you explain this to the other person? So it's a very loaded topic and it's got to be kind of self or maybe the couple goes at a healthier lifestyle together. That's one approach for sure. Um, and healthier lifestyle needs to be defined, obviously. But okay, before we step into the next ones too, can you explain your approach to how you successfully help your clients drop some body fat?
The way that I like to do it um, is, and this may bother some people in the bioenergetic sphere, but it's already on my channel at this point. I do actually set up a deficit for people because I haven't found that people will lose weight in a reasonable time frame at a reasonable pace unless it's done that way. So there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Like even if people stay at maintenance, they will, things get better over time, whatever. They may lose weight, but it may take a really long time. And a lot of people won't like if the one thing about people, and this, when I first started working with people, became immediately apparent to me. I've had clients who had kidney failure, cancer. If they don't see the weight move on the scale, they don't care about those other things. So they want to see things change. And so the way that I typically go about it is I find a Goldilocks zone where basically the person is, their diet is set up appropriately. They have a higher protein intake, carb intake is dialed in. So they have enough protein, preserve all the lean tissues, and they have enough carbs to minimize stress and spare the lean protein, their lean mass and the protein that the amino acids they have coming in. And I'll pull and play around with usually fats a little bit on the lower side, and I'll adjust carb intake as well to fit the caloric target that I set. And then basically I have them lose weight in a very slow, progressive fashion. And I've had clients, even women who are postmenopausal, who typically have the most difficult time losing weight, lose 20 pounds of body fat and gain muscle tissue through the process. We did put resistance training on board. That's one thing that I also incorporate. And it's just a slow process, concerted 1 to 2 pounds a week drop. And then you have the diets dialed in effectively, micronutrients are dialed in effectively, resistance training is set up appropriately, and then they get to that body composition. And the nice thing about this is once you get to the body composition in this setup that you want, the transition into normal eating is very simple. It's just you're eating a diet that you would already eat. It's not a sugar diet, it's not a carnivore diet. And then what winds up happening is you just adjust amounts and go back up to normal from there. And it's not like you have to track every single day when you do this process. You just set up some example days that you're going to typically run. You know how you're going to run them, and then you just set them on autopilot and go from there. A lot of people do that. Some people like to track because they like to see the macros and the data. Other people just, this is what I do every day, and a lot of people like to have a little variety, so they shift that up. So I typically set up when I'm running a deficit, I'll do somewhere between 20 to 30% on the deficit, but I typically start at 20%. And that's the line where I see people will lose that 1 pound to 2 pounds per week. Men will lose faster than women, especially if you're of muscle mass and you're active as a guy. It flies off. You don't have to. I had one client lose a pound a day on a 25%, 30% deficit. He wanted to go to 30. I was not a fan of going that high to start, but he's like, I need to see it come down. So in 100 days, he lost, I think, like 90 something pounds. And it was with the dietary setup. So he still had carbs, he still had protein. He was resistance training in the gym multiple times per week, and the weight just flew off, and all his metabolic markers and things got better. So I usually set things up in that way to get the weight off. And the other thing I do with this is I triangulate how the person's feeling. So I have the diet, and then I have what their symptoms are, and then I have what's going on the scale. They're losing at a reasonable weight. Diet's good, like intake is good, and they don't feel any symptoms. Great, keep going. If they're in a circumstance where they're not losing weight, they don't really have any symptoms, and the diet isn't really at the targets, I obviously adjust. Or if they're losing too fast and they don't feel very well, then I will usually adjust the diet so that they lose a little bit slower, because you can kind of gauge in real time somebody's symptoms based on how strong that deficit is. And then I see people's labs, so I can gauge like how stressful is this for the person, and I can see the reverse T3, and I can see their cortisol, their AM cortisol, and their DHEAS to cortisol ratios. And basically, a lot of times it doesn't. The guy who lost weight that rapidly because his deficit was at the 30% and he was really pounding the gym, his reverse T3 trickled up a little bit, which we then corrected on the back end by shifting him out of the deficit as he gets to his target weight. Um, but a lot of times, if it's set up appropriately, you don't see like cortisol get worse or reverse T3 get worse, or the ratio between DHEAS to cortisol get worse. and also you're gauging by the symptoms. So I typically run things in that fashion. That's how I've seen people lose weight. I've had a lot of clients lose a lot of weight doing it that way without really feeling a deficit. Like their sleep is fine, their mood is fine, their energy's fine. The biggest thing that the symptom that I usually will hear from people is like I get hungry right before my meal because I usually set the meals up across the day about 3 to 4 hours apart. And then as you get to your next meal, you start to get a little bit hungry. So that's how I set up the weight loss.
Calories in versus calories out matters?
But that is a good question though.
There's so much nuance and context there, but I really think that you dial in, like, at some point, like, the timing of these things matters, and if we all had 10 years to wait for our body composition to really change, that would be amazing, and of course, that's the most ideal situation, but we're kind of pretty much everyone's at this place of, "Oh, I've messed up so many years now, and I just wanna finally see results," and it's really hard to keep pushing and having hope and faith if you don't see those results come right away, and because of think of all the years we've done in the past of things that haven't worked or brought us 7 steps backwards, it's really motivating to see the results show up soon, and it's not like any of us are promoting extreme you see these like 1,200 calorie diet things, right? That's not sustainable. But when you set it up where you can work on your metabolism for a period of time and then enter a calorie deficit for a period of time, it's not a prolonged calorie deficit. That's where you're going to see the fat loss. And you can come out of that state at the end and slowly reverse diet and get back to eating normal. And if you with that fat loss, you have probably seen hormonal improvements, testosterone improvements for the males. I do have one question on those calorie deficits. Have you noticed certain macro splits that have helped preserve men or preserved hormonal levels for men? So, like certain carb levels, dropping fat too low, protein.
Yeah, so a couple things. To directly answer, there's two things I want to mention. To directly answer your question, there's a contextual dependent piece here. If you have a guy who's already pretty lean and you tank his fat too low, his hormones are gonna be terrible. Like his libido's gonna go, he's not gonna have morning wood anymore. And for ladies, I've had lady clients that dropped their fat too low and lost their cycle because they're like, oh, I can't go high fat because Randall's cycle 45 grams is too high. Like I'm not going to be able to oxidize carbs. And it's like, no, you're going to be fine. I promise. It's really going to be okay. You're still going to lose the weight. And they'll want it. They keep trying to hedge on lower fat. And they'll lose their cycle. Guys will have like negative impact on hormonal function. If you have, so you don't, in that circumstance, 20% of calories is fat, 20% of energy intake is fat, is the bottom threshold that I usually set. And the research also talks about this as well because you have to absorb fat soluble vitamins. You want to have gallbladder contraction to release bile acids so that you can clear out small intestine. And then also the fat is helpful for blood glucose regulation because it delays the gastric emptying and allows you to last longer between your meals. If you go too low fat, you're going to be hungry every hour. And it's the pure skim milk, orange juice, bioenergetic diet with granulated sugar. It's like the worst satiety diet ever. Like you're going to be hungry all day long running that type of setup because none of those factors, there's no fat. It's a lot of sugars that are very easily and rapidly absorbed. And then you're going to eat and be hungry like an hour later. And I know this because I did it. I had a lot of problems with that. And I dropped my own fat too low. And I basically was like a eunuch for the number of months that I had dropped my fat that low. I felt absolutely terrible. I couldn't function. So these types of things are really important. I've seen guys, I was in my early 20s. I've seen guys in their early 20s completely nuke their hormonal function, dropping fat too low. And women in their 20s as well do the same. You say, oh, they're in your 20s, you should be a stud. It's like, well, not if you don't have enough raw material for things to function well. On the flip side, though, if you have somebody who has quite a bit of body fat, guys in the upper 20s, women in the 30s, 40s, 50% body fat, they can get away with a little bit lower fat intake without it impacting them quite as much. Um, so in that circumstance, that can go a little bit lower, but I still have the 20% is typically still the line for me in those circumstances. Um, So I usually will run 20 to 30 on average. Some people do better with a little more fat. So they can go into the 30 to 40 range. But a lot of times it's 20 to 30 on average. And then depending on body composition and how the person responds, I will move the slider, right? So I've had clients do better with a little more fat. They're close to the 30. Clients who do better with a little more carbs, they're closer down to the 20% range. And this range I kind of dialed in over time after working with people. It's not like there's some research supporting some of the perspectives, but it's more just seeing kind of on average where people fall. Um, in terms of preserving lean muscle tissue, so that's hormonal function is having fat go too low, but also for stress hormones, adequate carbohydrates are absolutely important. So I'm not really going below about 150 grams per day most times. There's some little ladies I work with who much smaller have their targets are much different than like a guy who's 6'2", 200 pounds. They could probably go a little bit lower, but I really don't like to go that much lower than that target because that's the point at which you are having to rely on gluconeogenesis for your carbohydrate needs for your brain tissue, which I don't think it's good to start upregulating that process, not to mention whatever activity and other things you're doing across the day. So carbs minimum there and an adequate protein. I like to put people, depending on their context, between the 0.64 to 0.82 grams per pound per day. So if you're losing weight and you don't have a lot of metabolic dysfunction, you probably go up to the 0.82. Going 0.64 can improve some of the insulin sensitivity for some people because the amino acids can drive gluconeogenesis a little bit. So if you go a little bit lower and you bump the carbs up compensatorily and lower the fat, then you can see better insulin sensitivity for some people. So these are shifts that I make, and it's just contextually dependent on their body comp, metabolic state, what they respond to as an individual, and things like this.
I think we interfered with his outlining the steps. So that was
Oh yeah, that was fascinating.
that was one,
Yeah,
too much body fat potentially, and some
and that was very helpful and
very, very helpful. Yeah.
somebody.
To help guide through how to lose fat. So, what would be number 2 for reasons that you're seeing your clients potentially have low hormone levels for men?
So another big one is gut issues. Gut issues is really cause hormonal issues. Even if a guy's testosterone is okay, he may not have like the symptoms of having a good testosterone if the gut's all messed up. But I've seen quite a few guys have low testosterone who have gut issues, IBS or IBD type things, so Crohn's ulcerative colitis. Essentially, endotoxin, and there's other bacterial metabolites. We say endotoxin, but that's a very specific thing, lipopolysaccharide from gram-negative bacteria. But there's other components from gut bacteria as well that can create issues. And but directly in the research, they've showed that lipopolysaccharide, LPS endotoxin, can have a negative effect directly on testicular function by impairing the steroidogenic pathways of the Leydig cells, so the cells that produce testosterone. So if there's gut issues, I usually try to address those directly to get things under control. And then usually testicular function, testosterone levels can improve if that's the major driver, right? Because it's gonna vary. Like if you have one guy who's 30% body fat and he can eat whatever he wants, he has no digestive issues. He may have an endotoxin issue depending on what he's eating, but he may not have the same level as a guy who's like lean as a rail but has Crohn's disease or something like this. Like those are two different circumstances where you're troubleshooting a different problem. And it's important. That's why the context is important to see where your problems are.
And so probably paying attention to like ingredients that are on labels, trying to cook more of your meals from home, pay attention to food sourcing as much as possible. That's going to help kind of remove some of those problematic compounds that could be causing problems for that individual. And I think that's why it is so important to find carbohydrate sources that work well for you rather than forcing a carb that you've seen someone else do really well with, and you're just doing it because you think it's quote healthy. But we all are coming from unique places. We all live in unique microbiome or environments that impact our microbiome. And so fine tuning the carbohydrate sources that you do well with and understanding that your palette, your variety can expand over time as you improve those gut problems and your metabolic markers. But Are there specific foods that you have seen guys try to, like, really force eat in the name of health, and then actually that could have been the problem of the reason for their gut problems?
Yeah, and specifics of the bioenergetic sphere is I just finished my carnivore diet and I'm just gonna have meat and sugar. I'm just gonna throw granulated sugar and honey and maple syrup as my major carbohydrate sources because I'm still not sold on fiber and whatever else. And then I'm gonna do that with carnivore. I have seen that cause some serious issues. I've had young guys in their like 18 and 19-year-old get fatty liver doing that. And so I'll get their comprehensive metabolic panel. I'll look at ALT, AST, and their GGT, which are liver function values, and they're bumped. They're super bumped from trying to run this type of diet. So that's a big one that I've seen. Now, does this mean that I think that those are bad foods? No. But if you're going to do like 300 grams a day and it's just sugar, like just table sugar, I don't think that's a good idea from a microbiome standpoint, especially in the context of carnivore. Because in the carnivore diet, you basically have what's left over and goes to the colon and shifts the microbiome is heme iron, bile acids, and amino acids from the proteins that you're eating, which none of those three things are really known to have good impacts on the microbiome. Most times they upregulate gram negative bacteria and endotoxin producing species, as well as species that feed on bile acids and produce hydrogen sulfide gases. And then also components like indole, scatol, histamine, putrescine, cadaverine. So then you get the histamine intolerant stuff that goes in there. And so all of these things, like then throwing granulated sugar on top of that, which typically in high amounts is not associated with or shown to do good things with the microbiome, can be a recipe for a disaster. On top of the fact that a lot of people develop issues in carnivore diets and some of the low carb dieting around micronutrients, calcium to phosphorus balance, zinc to copper ratios, iron status, which further can have an impact on the liver. So if you're iron overloaded, you have a which I've had quite a few people iron overloaded from carnivore, and then they have dysbiosis in the intestine, and then you throw granulated sugar. It's just like you're making the perfect cake for some of these problems. And then correcting it does improve value. So I've had young guys testosterone drop from carnivore. You get things under control, and then testosterone um, picks up. And doing it, even coming to bioenergetic, they add carbs on board. They do feel better because the lack of carbs is problematic. But then you create new issues depending on which carb sources that you use. And also another one is if people don't tolerate dairy and they have problems with particularly the A1 casein that produces the beta casomorphin 7. There's from 1 to 11 beta casomorphins. They have an opiate effect that will essentially lower dopamine signaling, which raises prolactin signaling, and that shuts down LH and FSH, and then that can impact hormones. So for me, I'm extremely sensitive to casomorphins and even exorphins like the opiate peptides in wheat. And my testosterone was also pretty bad when I was doing tons and tons of milk. It really had a negative impact, and I'm lactose tolerant, so it wasn't the lactose was the issue. It was the casomorphins, the opiate peptides that gave me I was basically had no libido. I was having acne. I was at one point I thought I was getting gyno when I was drinking all the milk. So gynecomastia is like breast development. Um, and then basically when I stopped, like I dropped a ton of water weight, all of that stuff chilled out, and I felt significantly better. That doesn't mean milk is a bad food though, because I have clients who, milk is the majority, or not milk, but dairy products in general is the majority of their diet, and they thrive and they crush it. But I also have quite a few people where it's like, maybe you need to take it easy on the milk, man, and let's do a little bit of steak, a little bit of chicken, some good quality eggs, things like this instead, and see if you respond better. And if it doesn't make a difference, then it doesn't make a difference. Maybe the dairy is not the problem, but that could be another factor of foods that people introduce that can create issues overall.
For the dairy, what do you have people test to assess if they're having an issue with it?
So the symptom profile for casomorphins. And I made some podcasts on this with Ethan. Um, there's three major concerns with dairy. There's lactose, which we all know, right? It's like, oh, I'm lactose intolerant. Then there's casein, and then there's the hormones in dairy, and they have distinct profiles. Lactose intolerance, bloating, gas, loose stools, all this type of stuff. That one's easy to troubleshoot as well, right? Just have some yogurt, do whey protein, Have a hard cheese, take the enzyme if it doesn't give you digestive issues or whatever the deal is. That's a very easy solution. If it's casein, the casein and estrogen one are a little bit more difficult to parse out between them, but it doesn't really matter that much because the adjustments will be relatively similar. But for the casein, the symptoms that you'll see are very similar to what you would see with opiate medications. For me, I guess it seems pretty normal because in the ICU, like we would be pushing fentanyl and all different types of opiate medications all the time to patients who had pain and whatever else. And so you could see what the effects of that were. So you have constipation. Some people would get hives and rashes. You'd have sluggishness, brain fog, and you can see with the patients you wouldn't see this, but my dad, he got knee surgery. They put a fentanyl patch on him after his knee surgery. And basically, when he took the fentanyl patch, he's like, man, that stuff really knocked my libido out. I was like, when I took that off, I was like a new man again. So it can have a negative impact on your libido and your hormonal function. And so those are the symptoms that you will typically see with the casomorphins: constipation, rashes, histamine responses, or worsening of histamine responses. And on top of that, you can see issues with weight and libido and some of the hormonal components. So you'll see that with the casein, then with estrogens and dairy. And it's not all dairy, but commercially produced dairy has cows that have been hybridized to be pregnant like 300 something days of the year. And while they're pregnant, they have high amounts of estrogen production, which can show up in the dairy products, particularly in the form of estrone, which is E1. So it's not a very potent estrogen, but it does have estrogen signaling effects. And for some, not all people have a problem with it, but some people who do have a problem with it, then they'll start to see they can see impacts on their libido as well. And also, usually the thing I see with that is like acne, um, acne, and for some women, adjustments to their cycle. So that is person specific, and I tend to gauge based on symptoms because there's not really great testing to figure some of those things out. You'd have to do like pre and post testing on hormones, which, I just try to gauge based on symptoms. So I'll do an elimination on dairy just for a week or 2 weeks just to see how the person feels. And if they don't feel anything different, then great, have dairy, put it back in. If they do, it's like, okay, well, which form of dairy can you tolerate? If estrogens are the problem, well, it's mostly in the fat fraction of the dairy. So maybe you don't want to do high fat cheeses, high fat milks, high fat yogurts, and butter and cream, but you could do all the other things. If it's the casein protein, then you could probably get away with whey protein and some of the dairy fats like cream and butter and some of these components. So there's really a spectrum of options depending on the problem. It's not really an all or nothing thing. And you have to, it's a person by person base. So I do whey protein. I actually got people who are in the one of the videos I made, they're like, why do you have so much whey protein? But I do whey protein quite a bit because it saves me time. Logistically makes my life so much easier because I work a lot. So I can have 2 meals that's just a shake, and I can drink the shake while I'm on a client call, and it's not rude if I'm sitting there eating a steak. Or I can, like, after a workout, just have a shake while I'm on the go. And that makes it so I only have to have 2 other main meals a day. That's usually steak or chicken or something like this. So in that circumstance, I do have dairy every day, but I just don't do those forms that I don't tolerate.
I think that dairy, it was such a centerpiece of our ancestors' diet, and so many people think dairy is good, which I believe that dairy is good, but I think a lot of people forget that dairy has become a commodity. We have changed dairy so much over the last 100 years that, cows are being forced into confinement and they're being fed phytoestrogens, so things that are gonna increase the estrogen levels of dairy itself. They're fed soy, they're fed flax, and this A1 versus A2, more and more of our options are being A1, whereas we're kind of a little bit more used to the A2 dairy. And so I think that dairy quality matters so much. And it's hard. It's a hard discussion because people think that dairy should be cheap, but they don't realize that grocery stores sell most dairy products at a loss. Milk at your grocery store is a loss leader because they understand that milk brings someone into the grocery store. So they're okay with selling it as a loss because then they'll make margin on everything else that you buy in the store. But that discredits real food from better sources, and it's a difficult conversation to have, but understanding that, hey, you may not tolerate conventional dairy well, and that's honestly almost expected. It's changed a lot. So I think that's a really important point for someone analyzing their diet when they're looking at gut function, hormonal function. Hey, maybe this conventional dairy isn't serving me. And if it's not, either try, like you said, try the spectrum of options. cheeses, butter, cream, whey, skyr yogurts, and see if there's a spectrum, or try to find a higher quality that would work better for you. Yeah.
The other thing too with the ancestral point that you bring up, which is a good point. Um, a lot of the ancestral dairy that people were doing, I think, was like goat and sheep, and then also different breeds of cows than we currently see. And I think this is a hypothesis. I haven't fully looked into it, so don't hold me to all of it. But I think with goats and sheep and some of the smaller ruminant animals, you probably have less of a hormone burden because you don't with a cow, you have to take this like little itty bitty calf and bring it to like 1,000 pounds in a very short period of time with milk. So it's a for and especially in this circumstance, like the cows that you get now, the hybridized, they're not genetically modified, but they're hybridized, some of the Holstein breeds and things like this. They are larger, they have huge milk productions, and they're meant to be pregnant for long periods of time. And that hybridization process will likely shift what goes on with that milk and what goes on with that cow's hormonal profile because they're bred for some of this type of stuff. Compared to what you're getting back in the day with, like, if you look at the cows here in Costa Rica, like they're not that big and they're not that fat and they're not producing milk all the time. And then some of the breeds here are massively different. Like they have a lot of Brahman cattle here because I think they do better in the tropics and on the type of grass that they feed them here. Again, I'm not an expert on this stuff, but just like kind of looking around and noticing some of these things. But I think a lot of people in the past would have like goats or sheep or some of these smaller animals. And I think you would have had less of that concern. And I think you also would have seen that a lot of the dairy would have potentially been fermented dairy because you wouldn't have had a whole year, like 300 and something days of milk production from that animal. So you would have had to get the milk production while you had it and then convert it into dairy product or something longer term. So the way dairy was consumed and the animals that it was being consumed from in the past, I think was, as you alluded to, Ashley, quite a bit different than what we get nowadays.
So briefly, this is one of my with Nourish Food Club, we are also like creating we're trying to go back to like old fashioned food production. And so this is one of my passions. And one thing that you can see very visibly is if you look at like grass fed traditional cows. So, you know, traditional Jersey cows or other various quote like heritage breeds, they're a little bit smaller framed and their legs are shorter. Now contrast that to a Holstein cow, they've got super long legs because that's very advantageous for a factory dairy farm. But it takes a lot more hormones, a lot more calories to just build a frame on a cow. Then they have to start building fat. Whereas if you have shorter legs, shorter frames, not as much energy has to go into building that cow. And it like you said, it's quite a bit different. So if you are interested in adding more dairy, paying attention to the breed or the source or how that animal is raised, it really is important. It really is.
Yep. Yep. Of course.
Okay. Okay, so point number
3.
well, okay, wait, back to that. I think that's really empowering for people because if it's simply just doing a few experiments, if you've added dairy into your diet and maybe slowly over time things have shifted for the worse, you just listed some very approachable experiments for somebody to try. So I think that's great. So moving on to point number 3.
For
Yep.
why
How many you have total?
No, I think this is 3 for why male hormones or testosterone could be tanked.
We do tangents here and I love them. But yes.
Yeah, no worries. So there's a couple other ones. One of the big ones is thyroid function. People who are hypothyroid will tend to have lower testosterone values. The thyroid hormone is important for that whole star enzyme function to bring. So there's first of all, there's a couple things. Thyroid upregulates the LDL receptor. So the LDL receptor is on your cells, and it basically has the cells pull in LDL cholesterol, which is then it also upregulates star, which is an enzyme, as I mentioned before, that brings cholesterol into the mitochondria. So if your thyroid function is not doing so hot, then your ability to take cholesterol into the cell and into the mitochondria is not going to be so great. And then that can actually impair hormonal production across the board. So hypothyroidism is even subclinical hypothyroidism, where TSH is greater than 4 but less than 10, still see lower testosterone values. Greater than 10, definitely lower testosterone values. But even when you have a circumstance where the person has a like borderline thyroid function, which for me, I like it less than 2 on the TSH, not not less than 4. It's way too high. And definitely less than 10, but greater than 4 is still a problem. You still see the low testosterone. So correcting that is extremely important for having thyroid function or having testosterone work effectively, and also overall metabolic function, overall fertility. It's really important that thyroid's dialed in. So that's another big one that I see if thyroid function is low. And it doesn't even have to be that TSH is high. If T3 is low or reverse T3 is super bumped up, if those values are shifted, even if TSH is fine, that's a huge problem in and of itself. So I'm typically looking to see that T3 value, free T3, 3.2 to about 4. And I typically like to see the total T3 value greater than 130. If I'm not seeing those values and the reverse T3 less than 16, then I'm like, okay, thyroid, depending on how bad it is, like thyroid's either really sluggish or it's like quite sluggish. And we need to figure out why is it sluggish? Is it your diet? Is it your micronutrient status? Things like this. And one other piece I want to mention is, and the reason I say is because some of the bioenergetic stuff, people supplementing thyroid. If you go hyperthyroid, so you push your thyroid levels too high, you can also have a negative impact, particularly for men, but also for women, on hormonal function, because thyroid increases sex hormone binding globulin. And then basically you'll have all the testosterone, but it can bind up some of the SHBG. There's other concerns of going too high in thyroid as well, but that's one of them, is that you tend to see this change in or this increase in sex hormone binding globulin from the thyroid hormone. So you don't want to have it too high as well. There's an optimal level to be at with all of these things. There's a Goldilocks zone for thyroid function, even for the caloric intake. If caloric intake gets too low, like you see this in people who are training for bodybuilding competitions, they will basically like have hypogonadal status. Like there's guys on stage, natural bodybuilders, they look great, but they don't feel very great, and their testosterones are super low. And I have clients who are um, getting to those levels of leanness, not because I'm telling them to. They want to do their bodybuilding thing, or they want to do their get into shape for whatever. And like, yeah, it's probably not a good idea to get that lean, but they do it. And then they get their, I've had one client recently get his testosterone back. He's like, do I need testosterone? It's like, no, you need to get over 10% body fat, man. Like you're not going to last like this very long. You're not going to feel very good. So you can see it. There's Goldilocks zones for all of these things. Too much thyroid, too little, too much body fat, too little body fat. There's optimal components for all of them.
So, Mike, do you think that this is where carbohydrates are really playing a role? Because at the end of the day, thyroid, metabolism, they're connected, right? And so metabolic problems are going to cause low thyroid problems. Have you noticed, because so Sarah and I did carnivore in the past, and I know you have as well. And at that time, our cholesterol was so high. Sarah's was in the 700s, mine was in the 600s, and that lean mass hyper responder messaging. And then as soon as we added carbohydrates back, our cholesterol went back down into the low 200s. Have you noticed a relationship with high cholesterol and thyroid and also testosterone levels? Like, have you been able to successfully modulate those with macro tweaks?
Yeah. The so low carbohydrate dieting is another cause of lower testosterone. So as an example, Dr. Sean Baker, his testosterone levels are not really good, at least on some of his lab values that he's publicly shared. Um, and basically, there's two things that can happen when you go super low carb. A, either your testosterone levels can drop, or some people's testosterone levels can initially increase, but also with the decreased insulin signaling, what winds up happening is SHBG bumps up really high as well. So I've had guys, and this is interesting, and this is kind of a theory as well. But I've had a couple guys come from carnivore where their testosterone was over 1,000 nanograms per deciliter, but they couldn't get an erection. They didn't have any morning wood. They had no drive, and their workout performance was like pretty bad. And basically, when we brought carbs back in, their cholesterol is also high. So we could talk about that, but that's a little bit separate. It's kind of separate, not really, but like slightly tangential. Um, their cholesterol drops. I've had people, same thing. I had a client who was in the 800s go down into the 200s just with carbohydrate addition. But their cholesterol drops, their testosterone dropped. So it went from like 1,000 to like 700. So a 300 point drop. but they could get an erection now, and their SHBG dropped, and they had morning wood, and their workout performance was better, and a lot of things got significantly better in the hormonal department. So I'm also curious if on some of these diets, if there's an effect, like the cell's response to some of the hormones are adjusted depending on some of the state. That was the hypothesis, because like your levels got lower, but you feel 10 times better. It's quite an interesting setup, but it kind of makes sense, right? Because the hormones are just signaling molecules. The testosterone doesn't actually do anything itself. The testosterone is like the workman at a job site telling all the workers like, hey, make this house. But if you don't have the bricks and you don't have all the necessary component you need to actually produce that house, nothing's going to happen. So I think the state of the cells is really important for some of these things. And yeah, so you have a couple problems: lower testosterone, really high SHBG on the low carb dieting for some people, and then on top of that, you can get high levels and then like a lack of response. And I tend to see some of those guys, because the free testosterone can be quite low, even if the totals are high on those diets. And over time, it does usually ramp up and it gets worse. So in the beginning, it may help. Some guys' testosterone's improve initially on the low carb stuff, because you get a lot of the cofactors and important components actually increase your steroid hormones, right? You get a lot of cholesterol, you get a lot of fats, particularly monounsaturated and saturated fats, which serve as that precursor. You get a decent amount of iron, zinc, and these components will help with testosterone production. If you're doing liver, you get the vitamin A and you get some copper as well. Especially if you're coming from a crappy standard American diet or standard Western diet, it's a huge improvement, at least initially. And then the stress stuff kicks up over long term. And I think things start to go downhill.
Mm. Yeah.
You had a client that was 800 cholesterol. That's the first one that has beaten Sarah's 720 something that I've heard of.
Oh yeah. I mean, of course,
That,
at the time there was no T3, no T3, zero
what was
T3.
that, Sarah? I lost your audio.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, and of course, like at the time, matched with that, very very high cholesterol was just absolutely tanked thyroid function. So it all adds up. Yeah, there's a strong connection. So
Yeah.
that
The
was. Oh, go ahead. Keep
go,
going.
go ahead. Go ahead, Ashley.
That was number 3. I was gonna move on to 4, but if you have more on the thyroid metabolic, piece to why that's important for testosterone.
Well, um, the other thing is, with all that, well, it's going to get into a huge tangent, but basically when the lipids, when the cholesterol values run that high, and they see this in some of the obesity stuff, the lipoprotein metabolism can get altered as well. So even though you have all this cholesterol floating around, because people tend to say, oh, cholesterol doesn't cause heart disease. If it's just high, like it's protective, it's good. And it's like, well, why is it high? If Because the thing is, like, you can have a lower cholesterol. So for example, my cholesterol tends to run a bit lower on average. But it's not because I'm on a statin. It's because like I will uptake the cholesterol and use it well. And then over time on the when you have carbohydrates in, you don't need to have all these lipoproteins floating around to export fats to the tissues. So it's when you don't have the carbs, you upregulate the lipoprotein transport to start getting all the fat out and using it as a substrate. But that doesn't mean that the higher cholesterol then is going to improve testosterone. There's people that will, oh, if you lower cholesterol, like that will impact hormones. Like, depends on how you do it. You do it with drugs, like, yeah, well, that's very different than like you're lowering it by allowing the tissues to metabolize the lipoproteins better. That is the ultimate goal, not just seeing the value low because you're on a statin, bempedoic acid, or a PCSK9 inhibitor. Those are all very different circumstances and mechanisms. So I just wanted to add that piece there.
Yeah, for sure.
Um,
Do you have a 4th reason for why you see your clients hormonal?
you guys are gonna have to cut me off at some point because I have a lot of points, but um, another big one, and goes. I tried to pick the most bioenergetic ones that I could think of. Um, Polyunsaturated fatty acids from seed oils in high amounts. Now, this is from some rat studies, but basically in the rat studies with the polyunsaturated fatty acids, so they fed the rats a bunch of different types of fats. They did grapeseed oil, soybean oil, coconut oil, and olive oil. Now, the olive oil and coconut oil groups had the highest testosterone in the testicles and the best steroidogenic enzyme function. So those enzymes I talked about in the beginning, the CYP11A1, 11 beta HSD, or 13 beta HSD, 13 beta steroid, or let's see, 13 beta HSD, hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase, and then the 17 beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase. Those enzymes function was better in the olive oil and coconut oil group. Soybean oil and grapeseed oil group, not so great. So you had higher testosterone, better enzyme function, and on top of that, you had lower lipid peroxides, lower DNA damage, and overall lower protein oxidation. So much better overall for fertility is not relying on soybean oil and grapeseed oil as your major source of fats. Ideally, in the research as well, the monounsaturated and the saturated fats perform the best for hormonal function across the board, whereas polyunsaturated fats, particularly seed oils, don't do well at all. They tend to have worse effects across board, and in the animal models, they don't do good things for testicular function. So I'd really recommend avoiding those.
Yep. Yeah, that tracks. We just did a I feel like my mic is just slowly falling down. Can you hear me? I'm just gonna lean over. We just did a podcast on sperm production and quality, and PUFAs was obviously something that we talked about. There was very strong correlations between damaged sperm and PUFA consumption. So it makes sense that it would also impact your testosterone production. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, the fats are very fragile, and when they get incorporated into the tissue structure and you have any type of oxidative stress or insult, which or even like general oxidative metabolism, the risk of damage to those fats, lipid peroxidation, I think increases considerably. So not loading your tissues up on those is a good idea. And then obviously things like adequate vitamin E, vitamin C, things like CoQ10, some of the plant polyphenolic compounds, adequate mineral intake, which that's the next one, vitamin and mineral intake, which allows for antioxidant function. All of those are important to protect against the damage that you get from loading your tissues up on polyunsaturated fat. Basically, think of the polyunsaturated fat like dynamite. So like you're storing dynamite, and if you don't have any fires lit, you're good. But as soon as you light that fire and the fuses go, you're kind of screwed.
Yeah. And
It's a good analogy.
I think that that's important too when you're like losing your body fat over time. You are oxidizing your fat. And if your fat is higher in polyunsaturated fats, there are going to be long term consequences to that. Now, I don't think that that should be a reason why someone should be afraid of losing fat, but there are long-term consequences to our dietary fat choices, and we're kind of seeing the results of that with this huge change in the food system over the last 100 years. We're stuffing animals in the confinement buildings, we're changing the fatty acid composition of chicken and pork, we're dousing everything in seed oils, we got rid of butter and tallow. And so there are consequences to the types of fat that one consumes, and I think that's where all of us are in alignment. We agree that calorie intake matters, but we don't agree that a calorie is a calorie because there's better choices for your fat sources. There's better choices for your carbohydrate sources. And so paying attention to the quality of your dietary fats is very
Mhm.
important for male testosterone and hormonal production.
Yes, 100%.
Yeah.
And I want to tail into that. That was the second point from a while ago I didn't talk about was the calorie stuff. So I know there's like, I guess, a slight tear in the sphere about calories, right? Because people come in, they're gaining a bunch of weight, and it's like, well, how do I lose the weight? And it's like, well, not calories. But the thing is, the way I look at it, there's a couple pieces. A, calories are just a tool. If we want to talk about how much energy somebody needs in a day, like, don't we want to kind of quantify it a little bit so we can give people a rough idea of where they can draw the line in the sand, like what they're shooting for roughly? I think that's important because people come in and then it's like, well, I'm just gonna eat as much as I want and to keep going endlessly, and then they're gaining weight. And it's like, well, my metabolism's not catching up. And when you look at the research with overfeeding, it doesn't necessarily get to a point where like you can endlessly eat and you just won't gain weight. Like the body does actually put fat tissue on. That is a normal thing. That is a good thing that happens when you overeat. The thing is if you have too much fat tissue, it becomes a problem. So it's not a question of like like either or. It's not a dichotomy. It's like a spectrum of things. So the calories are a tool that allow us to just kind of quantify foods in terms of volume as energy. It's like money, right? If you guys purchase a farm and then say you want to go have a vacation and you want to get a boat and you want to purchase a boat, how do you quantify like your output from your farm to purchasing the boat. You need some in like metric to gauge that, some fungible unit. So you have money. With food, you have calories, and that's just for energy. Tells you nothing else about the food. So for me, it's like I need to give people as a clinician working with people, I need to give them direction. And if I can't draw a line in the sand anywhere for them, like I can't help them effectively and I can't make adjustments effectively. So calories are helpful for that so that people can actually have a direction. But I tend to think of things in a food ladder or a dietary ladder. So you have calories at the top and you just figure out how much energy you need roughly for your goals. Okay, good. You have some threshold there. It only tells you quantities. That's it, nothing else. Then after that, then you get to macros. So now you have protein, you have carbs, you have fat, and you can kind of group fiber into that. So it's like, how much of these things do we need? And it's not, I can't have carbs if I have fat, or I can't have fat if I have carbs. The question is more, how much of each of these things do I need to optimize my health? Not like one or the other. There's not the dichotomies. It's what's the threshold for my requirements. Then after that, you start to get into how do I construct my meals? And then how do I organize my meals across the day? So meal structure, meal timing. And then you have food selection. Which foods am I going to use to hit all of that? It's very important. And then from those foods, you have food quality. And then after that, you get to micronutrients, your vitamin and mineral status, dialing all of that in. So when you're constructing a diet, you have all these camps, calories in, calories out. If it fits your macros, intermittent fasting, carnivore, keto, plant-based, low fat, high carb, yeah, sugar diet. And it's like they all just optimize for one thing. And they're like myopic on this one particular thing. And it's like, if anything, we want to have for me, I go through this checklist. There's this checklist of things we want to get dialed in. And we want to get all of these dialed in. Your meal timing. So that covers intermittent fasting, your macros, if it's your macros, calories in, calories out, your carbohydrate intake, your fat intake, your protein intake, your fiber intake, fiber for plant-based, fat intake for your keto people, carb intake for the sugar dieters and the Kempner people, protein intake for the bodybuilders, right? And the carnivores, the carnivore eaters. So all of these things are important. And we're trying to figure out what's the optimal amount of this recipe that we're making for our diet for our goals instead of getting into these dichotomous camps that people run into. And so I see it more of this comprehensive system and this ladder instead of like, oh, it's just, it's just about macros. Nothing else matters. It's like, it's a very myopic view. Instead, this perspective, or the one I try to come from, incorporates the pros and the truth and nuance from all of those spheres while kind of getting rid of the ideology and the black and white thinking that we see inside those spheres.
I think the biggest issue, Mike, is that a lot of people are in a state of learned helplessness, and all of those things are very overwhelming, right?
No, they all promise like really quick or surprising results too. Or they might get you a quick result, but like you said, that usually doesn't last and it could lead to negative health outcomes too.
And so it's easier for someone to use a quick fix diet than it is to look at this ladder that you just outlined, because it is a lot of work, but your health is an investment. It does require some work, especially in this crazy modern environment that we live in. And that's, I think, why there is benefit to having a coach or doing a group coaching. Like we have Transform and various coaching groups that can help guide you through it if you're too overwhelmed to do it yourself. It's okay. Like there's a lot going on in the world, and I know people are very busy, but paying attention to these variables do matter. They do.
Yeah. Yeah. They make a massive difference. Especially because it's the one thing. I think there's two different states. There's somebody who's already sick, and then there's somebody who hasn't gotten sick. And preventing sickness is easier than recovering from sickness or meta dysfunction, however you want to call it. So recovering takes a little bit more time and energy and effort, and you need to pull out more stops than if you are just preventing. And so, by the time I'm working with somebody, it's like they have a problem and they need to get it fixed. And my job is to fix that problem, which requires me to make these adjustments and target these specific components to try to resolve it as fast as possible and make as much progress as possible so that they can get to that state where they're just in maintenance and they just like living their daily life and they have a system in place that's already built out and that they can run with. The thing is though, is that a lot of these variables that I'm talking about in the initial culture before the advent of, the current dietary systems and diet wars and whatever else kind of existed, right? Like people were having 3 meals a day. You go look at the cookbooks, they were having like potatoes and steak, and they were using like the monounsaturated, saturated fat sources. And then they also were having foods that were like farm fresh foods because you couldn't get the factory farm stuff. So the variables and the needles that I have to move now were things that were already ingrained in the existing culture previously that have just been shifted over time. And so it's like that's the difference is we are now growing up in a dysfunctional cultural model where it's like, well, what do you have for breakfast, Captain Crunch? What do you have for lunch? It's like Gushers, fruit roll-ups, and
Lunchable.
well, yeah, and a Lunchables. And it's like that's that foundation is not set up appropriately from the jump. And then it's like, oh, there's so much work to change all this stuff. Our ancestors didn't do this. Like our ancestors also didn't have Lunchables and Captain Crunch and God knows whatever else people are doing. They had a completely different cultural model and system. And so it's like you're rectifying people's habits, which is a little bit difficult at times. And it takes a little bit of time to adjust. Once you get it down, it's easy. Once you get used to living in this type of way, it's not very difficult because it's your norm. It's just when you go from your norm to a not to something that wasn't your normal and you have to make that switch, there's learning involved, there's shifting of habits involved, and it requires action and participation instead of just passiveness where when you're a kid it's passive, right? You just your parents give you Lunchables for lunch and that's what you eat and that's what you're used to. So when you get older, it's like you show up to work, it's like, oh, I have two Lunchables because I'm bigger now. So that's what I think that's why I think it seems so much more now.
I think that's really helpful, just to consider that having a coach, if that switch from, you're just doing a normal routine and you wanna make a huge lifestyle change is very overwhelming or it's intimidating, having somebody to walk you through that process is so helpful. Like, I'm sure you've had your fair share of coaches in the past or, mentors, and we've been through our own program coached by Kathleen to get the result that we wanted. And we all know all this information, but having somebody to walk you through it for yourself can sometimes be what actually gets you there for good instead of like trying something new and then falling off the wagon again because you fall back into your old habits. Maybe it's not as extreme as going back to 2 to 3 Lunchables a day, but, we can be on a spectrum of making decisions that might not be improving our health and so keeping us pretty stagnant. So, we've been through a ton of good points today to help somebody take the next step on improving their hormonal health as a male. I think you've made it very clear that it comes back to your everyday dietary and lifestyle decisions as far as just having a better healthier hormonal level as your maintenance. So either whether or not this is for somebody who's trying to improve their fertility, I think that we can all agree that having optimal levels of hormones impacts your day-to-day life and how you feel and how you function and even finding a relationship or making the decision to have a baby, you kind of need to be there already, otherwise it's just not something that you're interested in. So is there anything else that you feel like is super important or do you feel like we've covered most of the main topics today?
I just want to add two more, and I
Oh,
won't
great,
go on
this
my
is great.
tangents. They're quick ones. Micronutrients and stress. When you have stress hormones, specifically cortisol, the glucocorticoids, they directly impact LH synthesis. They can directly impact the LH receptors on the Leydig cells, and they can directly impact the steroidogenic enzymes at the testicles, as well as destroy or induce the programmed cell death of Leydig cells. So, long term chronic stress is not your friend if you are trying to have optimal fertility or hormone levels, and the glucocorticoids directly impact testicular function. And then on top of that, a big one that I address with many clients is their micronutrient status. So selenium, iron, zinc, copper, your B vitamins, um, all of these things are extremely important to get dialed in and not have, particularly for the minerals, you can have iron overload, which can create problems, or anemia, iron deficiency. You can have too little zinc, too little copper, all of these components, too little vitamin D. These are all extremely important in figuring out root cause in terms of having low testosterone or impaired fertility. And I've had a couple clients just fix micronutrients, not do thyroid replacement, not do testosterone replacement, and just doing that has fixed their function, their testicular function, their thyroid function, their temperatures increased, their TSH drops without having to do anything as far as replacement therapy. So those are really important ones across board. And for myself personally, when I was working in the ICU, I was still doing all the podcasts and working with clients, but I was doing that and I was doing the 50 hours a week in the hospital. My hormone levels looked bad. Like they got worse. They were fine before, and then when I did that, it was pretty bad. It's just I was overworked, like, and it showed up in my labs.
So, well, I think the micronutrients, that's another important feature of tracking your food intake for some period of time, because how else would you know what your vitamin and mineral status was if you didn't track for a period of time? So that's a benefit of
Well,
logging
he also says testing too.
and testing for sure.
Well, you do both.
Yeah.
You do both.
Yeah.
That's especially if the first step is chronometer. Just put 1 day in. You don't have to put every day in. You just put 1 day in. Just see where you're at roughly, and you'll see where your gaps are. And then I usually just supplement people's gaps from where they are in chronometer, and then see how if they feel better. Like I spoke with a lady last night, and she was having terrible PMS, holding lots of water weight, and all this type of stuff. I shifted her diet and I covered her micros, and she was also having ADHD around different cycles of her period or different periods of her menstrual cycle. And we corrected micros, we corrected diet. And she's like, yeah, I'm not really swelling. My PMS is better. And I don't feel like I have ADHD anymore. So we don't have to do anything for that. Like, I think I'm pretty good. I was like, okay, great. That's all we need to do. So we'll follow up and see some of the testing because she's looking to have kids in the future. So we're going to check on her fertility markers in the labs that I mentioned earlier. But yeah, a lot of times you just do that and things work well. It's if things still aren't moving the way you want it to, then you follow up on those labs. So I do it in a systematic process: diet, micros, target some of the specific problems, and then depending on what's going on, do the labs. Or if you think you're going to want to have kids, I think it's worth it to spend the money to get the labs before you have kids to make sure that everything's dialed in, you minimize complications, because those things on the back end of working in the hospital, if things go wrong, like you don't want to be in that spot. It's not a good place to be when things get messed up. I've been in the ICU. I spent some time in labor and delivery, and like there's a lot that can get messed up if people's health are bad, and it's important to not get to that spot.
Preventative care versus sick care.
Yeah,
But
100%.
okay, so let's go over the 6 that you covered. So first was having too much body fat.
Yes.
What was the second?
Was it endotoxin?
And gut
Gut-
problems.
gut-
Gut problems. Number 3.
Dairy.
No,
Yeah.
3 was dairy?
Yeah.
Oh,
I think that one snuck in there when you were asking me about foods that could be problematic.
that was in number
Um,
2.
Oh, okay. That
so
was too
then we
gut.
had body fat, gut, uh, polyunsaturated fats, thyroid function, stress, and then micronutrients.
Perfect.
Okay.
So those are the 6 things to address, and if you aren't tracking your food or you don't know what your intake is, start there, because that could solve a lot of problems. But
Okay.
Mike, thank you so much for coming on today. You guys will love Mike's YouTube channel, so that's one way to find him, but tell us where people can find more about you, your social media channels, your website, how people can sign up to work with you if you have spots available. Lay it out.
Yeah, so the best places to find me are on my YouTube channel, which is just Mike Fave on YouTube. And then my website is mikefave.com. And then basically I have one-to-one consulting, and then I have a coaching program that I do that's like around targeting getting into the weeds of solving these specific problems, gut issues, hormonal issues, and in-depth components like this.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Mike. Appreciate the time today, and hopefully we can get you on again soon to dive into even more of these topics. But appreciate all of your time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate the invitation.